Okay. My representation entitled Representation of Qualifying Secondary Teachers Regarding the Investigative Approach in Morocco. So, according to several educational contexts, the masterful approach is still dominant in the transmission of knowledge at Moroccan school. In order to overcome the passivity of the student in the learning, the innovation calls insist of the fact to identify new forms and models of learning and teaching. The educational approaches that encourage effective learning among students is the investigative approach, which demonstrates more and more its potential in teaching. What means the investigative approach? It's based to research work of Darley on 2007. It means a scientific approach based on questioning and investigation where the act, reason, the minor, and communicates to build his learning while by being an actor in scientific activities. So this approach is part of socio-constructivist perspective, promoting exchanges between students in order to build their own knowledge. The aims of this research is, one hand, to highlight the representation of secondary school teachers qualifying on the concept of investigative approach, to see if this approach is adopted or not in teaching of experimental science discipline and earth science, science of physics and chemistry. In the second hand, to determine the constraints and obstacles to its implementation. In order to achieve objectives, a questionnaire was drawn up as an exploratory study formed by a questionnaire axis of three axes. Like the first axis is about teacher representation, about investigative approach. The second axis, adoption or not of this approach, and the third axis is to determine the difficulties that hinder its implementation in the classroom among 36 qualifying secondary teacher of experimental sciences at Marrakech city. So the results reveals that for the first question, which we want to give, we ask the teacher's questioner to give the appropriate definition of the investigative approach. 56% of teacher questionnaire give us the correct definition. It's the choice C, which means that this investigative is the scientific approach, questioning and investigation, which constitute scientific disciplines. But the rest, the later teacher questionnaire give us the false and incorrect choices A or B. So the results reveal, the data of these results reveals us the presence of erroneous representation and confusion concerning the correct definition of the investigative approach among almost half of teacher questionnaire. For the second question, we want to know if there is a difference between investigative approach and experimental approach. The majority of teacher questionnaire, almost half of teachers affirm that there is no difference between the investigative approach and the experimental approach. They say that the investigative approach is the same, it's the experimental process. That these results confirm the first question, the first question, which give us that it exists the presence of erroneous representation among these teachers. So for the third question, have you ever benefited from continuous training concerning the investigative approach? The majority of teacher questioned have not received a continuous training on investigative approach, which make it difficult to you adopt the investigative approach in your teaching. Teachers provide do not this do not adopt this approach. It seems that these teachers are reluctant to change their working methods. For the fifth and the sixth question, we asked the teacher to determine and the constraints that prevent the adoption of investigative approach in the teaching in the classroom. The choice, the overload program, the lack of students' autonomy, the overload of the number of students, lack of continuous training. So, for conclusion, for the first question, the presence of erroneous representation and confusion concerning the correct definition of the investigative approach. This data show that a priori teachers' representation can hinder the implementation of this approach in the classroom. These data are corroborated with a study conducted by our research team at 2017, which highlighted the presence of erroneous representation among teachers regarding the investigative approach, but in the another city of Morocco. The second question, almost half of the teachers affirm that there is no difference between the investigative approach and the experimental approach. They say that the investigative is the experimental process. These results correlate with those obtained in research at national level or international education systems, which show that teachers of different disciplines sometimes perceive differently the notion of the investigative approach. For the third question, the data shows that the majority of teachers have not received continuous training on investigative approach. Indeed, the lack of continuous training on new pedagogical approaches and of the erroneous representation identified among the teachers survived. This finding is consistent with a study by Boven on 2016, which underlined that training on this approach is a necessity and a declared need by teachers. For the first, fourth, and the fifth, sixth question, show us a multiplicity of difficulties and contrasts that can limit the implementation of investigative approach in places, namely the overload program, the lack of students' autonomy, the overload of the students' number, and the lack of continuous training for teachers. These results are consistent with data from the literature, which reveal the teachers face multiple difficulties as time and overload schedule, lack of student autonomy to implement this practice. So, the erroneous representation, as well as the contrast stated throughout the study, underline the importance of the continuous training for the teachers on the new approaches, in particular on investigative approach. Accordingly, training allows them to go beyond their initial representation to become aware and train in new pedagogical approaches. And thank you for your attention.